All right, guys, let's talk about the Civil War. Before we get into the actual war itself, there's some background information that it's a little bit of a review, but just will kind of set the context for what happens in the Civil War. First, remember at the very end of what we talked about with the causes of the Civil War, the final straw that caused the southern states to one by one, 11 of them to secede from the United States and establish their own separate country. The final cause was the election of 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln was elected as the first Republican president in U.S. history. Now, the Republican Party was founded as an anti-slavery party after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but Lincoln was a moderate Republican. In his first inaugural speech, which is the speech you give when you first become president after your inauguration, he openly said that he's not going to abolish slavery. He did not think he had the authority as president to do so. He did not think it was constitutional. But what he did say is that he was opposed to the expansion of slavery. That's the key part. The expansion of slavery into new territories and new states that would be added to the United States. And he also went on a little further to say his only goal as president, his primary goal, was to preserve the Union, keep the United States together, keep the North and the South united. He is now coming in as president at a very critical point in U.S. history where the country is about to explode at the seams, and his goal is to keep the country together. We know that doesn't happen. Eventually, they'll get the country back together, but during the war, they separate. But again, he does not want to end slavery where it already exists, like in the South, in Georgia. He only wants to oppose its expansion into new territories. He also believed in, when talking about nullification, the right that a state has to cancel out or not follow a law. And the question was, do states have that right? We talked about that with the cause of the Civil War. Well, Lincoln does not believe that states have the right to nullify laws or secede from the Union. He believes that the Union is indivisible, just like when you say the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God, indivisible, not able to divide the country. He believes that is the only way for the country to survive. So states cannot nullify laws. They have to follow federal law even if they don't like it. And they do not have the right to leave or secede from the Union. Well, just a little more than a month after Abraham Lincoln's elected president in 1860, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede from the United States. Shortly thereafter, 10 other states follow, and by the summer of 1861, all 11 of the Confederate States of America have seceded from the United States. Georgia seceded about a month after South Carolina in late January 1861. So together, those 11 southern states, they do establish a new country that they will call the Confederate States of America. Remember, a confederacy is a loose alliance. Basically, going back to kind of the Articles of Confederation days, where the South believed that was the way to go, where the federal government needed to have maybe a little bit more power, but the states should be almost like independent countries and have a lot of authority. They should have more individual power. So their goal was to do that in the Confederate States of America. But here's the issue. Lincoln and the United States never actually recognized the Confederacy as a separate country. So on one hand, you get the Southerners saying, yeah, well, we've left the United States. We've created our new country, the Confederate States of America. But Abraham Lincoln and the United States say, no, you haven't. You're still part of the United States because you don't have the right to secede from the Union. So that sets up what this Civil War is actually going to be about. The Civil War is going to determine whether the Southern states actually do have the right to secede and create a new country. That's what they're fighting over. So if the South or Confederacy wins, they will get their independence, just like the United States did from Great Britain. However, if the North or Union wins, the South will have to give up its claim on independence and rejoin the United States. So that's really what the war is about. The North is fighting to keep the Southern states in the Union. That's the main goal. First, for them, it wasn't all about slavery. It was about keeping the United States together. Because if the United States is separated, the country loses half of its revenue, a lot of its power, and all the gains they had made through the era of Manifest Destiny will essentially be wiped away. So here's what you're looking at in the Civil War. You've got down here at the bottom, this kind of lighter blue shade. These are the southern states that have seceded before Fort Sumter, and there's a few more that secede after. Fort Sumter is the first battle. We'll get to that in a second. Now let's introduce the war itself. The war goes from 1861 to 1865. There's a couple different names that it goes by depending on what part of the country you're from. If you're from the North, you might call this the War for Southern Independence or the War of Southern Secession. If you're from the South, you might call this the War of Northern Aggression, where the Northerners are coming down and being aggressive and trying to impose their will on the southern states who want their independence. Different names identify both sides. The North can also be called the Union, the United States even, the Yankees, of course, and the Bluecoats, or just blue. They wore blue in battle. The South, on the other hand, went by the name the Confederacy. They wore gray. They could be called Johnny Rebs, just like the Yankees would be called, or the Northerners would be called the Yankees. All in all, 620,000 Americans will die in this war. It's the bloodiest war, deadliest war in American history. And in many cases, historians call this war the Second American Revolution because many of the same issues that were fought over in the American Revolution are fought over in the Civil War, including states' rights, the idea of slavery, the economic direction of the country. So there's a lot of the same issues that are at play here. And think about it. The South was really doing just what the American colonists did to the British. They felt the British were abusing their rights as British subjects, were taxing them too harshly, and were not looking out for their best interests. So they said, when that case happens, we have the right to rebel and establish our own new country. The Southerners are doing the exact same thing. They felt, just like the American colonists felt with the British, they felt that the U.S. government, the federal government, was violating their rights and not treating them fairly. So in that case, they have the authority to rebel and start their own new country. That's exactly what they're trying to do here. So let's talk about the war actually kicking off. It all begins in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was one of the few remaining federal or U.S. forts in the southern states. Most of them have been closed down after the southern states started to secede, but Fort Sumter is one of the few that was still remaining. Lincoln is notified that the supplies to Fort Sumter, for the soldiers that are stationed in Fort Sumter, they're going to run out pretty soon. And when that happens, they're going to be forced to surrender to the Confederacy, which means the United States is going to lose a federal fort to the South. So Lincoln's got a risky choice here. He's got to decide, is he going to supply the fort? And by doing so, they could potentially risk war with the Confederate States of America, because they might see that down in South Carolina. They might see that as the Northerners invading a separate country. Because remember, to the South, to South Carolina, they had separated from the United States and created their own new country. So the United States comes into South Carolina, the South Carolinians might view that as an invasion of their country. So if he supplies the fort, it could risk war with the Confederate States of America. Or he could just sacrifice the fort. But if you sacrifice the fort, then you set a really bad precedent and you look weak. Lincoln ultimately decides on kind of like a halfway solution. He decides to send non-military reinforcements. He just wants to send supplies like food, things like that, to stock the soldiers that are in Fort Sumter. But the Confederacy, again, they view this as an act of war. You have a foreign country in their view coming into their country without permission. So because of this act of war, the Confederacy goes ahead and they attack Fort Sumter. They bombard. You can see here in the picture, they're bombarding Fort Sumter with cannon fire. And Lincoln, when this happens, now Lincoln is going to call for 75,000 troops to put down the insurrection in the South. So this is when the first federal U.S. troops are actually called out as part of the Civil War. So because of this, 4 more states that had not yet seceded and joined the South, they now secede, and the South gets even stronger and gains even more states. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina had not seceded before Fort Sumter. After Fort Sumter, they will now join the Confederacy. Once these 4 new states in the Confederacy, they establish Richmond, Virginia as the capital city of the Confederate States of America. So Washington, D.C., still the capital of the USA. Richmond, Virginia becomes the capital of the CSA. And again, there's just a different viewpoint here between the North and the South. The South views the North as the aggressor because they came into South Carolina and tried to supply their military fort. And the North views the South as the aggressor because they're the ones that started firing on Fort Sumter. So it's just, again, a difference of opinion. Before we get into the battles themselves, let's talk about the border states real quickly. So not every slaveholding state actually ended up seceding from the United States. There were 4 of them: Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. Basically, these colors here, the kind of purplish color, pinkish purple color, you can see they basically create a border between the Union up north and the Confederacy down south. That's why they're called the border states. Now, these are slave-holding states that actually chose to remain as part of the United States and not secede. And part of that was because of Lincoln's very wise use of federal policies in wartime powers. It was controversial, some of the things he did, but largely because of some of his actions, those states stay part of the United States. Here are some of the controversial actions Lincoln took to keep those border states in the Union. He sent troops in to supervise elections to make sure that no secessionists were being elected and things were being done fairly. There was no corruption, no cheating in the elections. And this was the really controversial part. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which is the right to be taken before a judge. So basically, if you're accused of a crime, habeas corpus gives you the right to go before a judge and a jury and have a trial rather than just being thrown away in a prison without anyone really standing up for your rights and having a chance to actually defend yourself. Well, anyone who is accused of secessionist beliefs or trying to stir up secession in the border states, they were just flat out arrested and thrown in prison, and they threw away the key. There was no court. There was no judge that went before. There was no jury. People's rights were just being taken from them. And the Constitution actually gives the president this right in emergency times for an emergency measure. And Lincoln called this, obviously, time for emergency measures, so he went ahead and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Because of that, he imprisons over 13,000 Confederate sympathizers, people who sympathize with the Confederacy in those Union states. So anyone in those border states that was trying to stir up ideas about secession and maybe leading those states, Maryland, Kentucky, Virginia, not Virginia, Delaware, and Missouri, he went ahead and arrested them, so there was never really a movement for those states to secede. And again, Lincoln again declares that the purpose of the Civil War, in his view, is to preserve the Union. He does not talk about ending slavery. To him, that's not what it's about at first. To him, it's all about keeping the United States together, preserve the Union. And that's important. The reason he says that is because he wants to keep the border states in the Union. Remember, these are slave-holding states. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland. These are slave-holding states. So if he goes out and says publicly that he wants to end slavery and the Civil War is about taking slaves away from the Southerners, well, then those border states are going to join the South because they want to keep their slaves. So he has to say the Civil War is not about slavery, it's about keeping the Union together. And that's going to convince the border states to stay a part of the United States. All right, so now let's look again here. So same map we looked at a little earlier with the border was the states that had seceded before Fort Sumter. The states right here in kind of this purplish color that secede after Fort Sumter, including Virginia, which is a very important slaveholding state. And then you have the border states right here: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. Now we see West Virginia here. I did not mention them. West Virginia was part of Virginia prior to the Civil War, but this northwestern part of Virginia was an area that was heavy on abolition. So when Virginia decides they want to secede and leave the United States, the western part of Virginia, this northwest part, decides they want to stay a part of the United States. So they separate from Virginia, and that's when you have the creation of West Virginia. So the Confederate States of America, just like any country, is going to develop its own constitution. That's what a country has to do: develop a constitution and set up a brand new government. So let's talk about that government a little bit. The Constitution of the Confederacy was almost a carbon copy of the U.S. Constitution. It was very similar in most ways, but there was one fatal flaw. Think about it. Since the Confederacy was created by secession, all these southern states that are in the Confederacy had seceded from the United States. Well, since it was created by secession, they can't turn around in their Constitution and say that states don't have the right to secede in the future. That's a problem, because now if they pass laws that states don't agree with, all those states are just going to leave and start a new country. So you have this kind of revolving door of this potential of, well, if the Confederacy passes a law that some states don't like, that Georgia doesn't like, Georgia will just secede and start their own country. Again, do it all over again. So it's kind of just revolving door. The states were essentially given too much power, which made the Confederacy a weakened government during the Civil War. The president of the Confederate States, a little different than the president of the United States, was elected for a 6-year term. They could only be elected one time. They could only serve one term, and that was a 6-year term. Congress could not raise the protective tariffs. Remember, the tariff was a major issue. They can't have one. States' rights is guaranteed, and so is slavery in their Constitution. And their president was a guy named Jefferson Davis. He believed in a very strong... His idea of a strong central government was barely opposed. He was a Southern who actually believed in the power of a strong central government. Some states in the Confederacy didn't even want to send their troops to fight outside their states. Like if you're in Georgia, some people just wanted Georgia's troops to fight in Georgia, not go elsewhere outside of our state. So because of this, Davis was often at odds with the Congress of the Confederacy, and they almost actually impeached him. And he just lacked Lincoln's political skills.